You've probably seen that famous painting, Las Meninas, the one hanging in the Prado Museum in Madrid. Art teachers love it. That little blonde girl standing in the center, surrounded by her attendants and a sleepy dog, staring straight at you with those wide, curious eyes. Her name was Margaret Theresa of Spain, and when that painting was created in 1656, she was just 5 years old, and already the most valuable child in all of Europe. Kings were negotiating over her future marriage before she could even read. Her future husband, yes, husband, was already receiving portraits of her as a toddler, watching her grow up from hundreds of miles away like she was some kind of long-term investment. But there's something those paintings never showed, something no court artist was allowed to capture. Because while Margaret stood there in silk dresses, glowing under perfect lighting, something much darker was happening inside her body. Slowly, quietly, unstoppably. Margaret Theresa was a Habsburg, and the Habsburgs had spent over 200 years marrying their own blood. By the time she was born, her family tree didn't branch outward like a normal one. It folded inward, looping back on itself again and again. And that loop would eventually crush her, long before she ever reached her 22nd birthday. To understand what happened to Margaret, you have to understand the system she was born into, the Habsburg machine. It all began back in 1273, when a man named Rudolf became king of Germany. From that moment on, the family had one single obsession: not war, not religion, not conquest through violence, marriage. The Habsburgs figured something out very early. You could gain more power through weddings than through battles. Why fight for land when you could marry into it? So they did exactly that. They married into every royal family they could. Kingdom after kingdom, absorbed not with swords, but with rings. Like a sponge soaking up water, they expanded across Europe. At their peak, they controlled Austria, Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, large parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and massive overseas territories stretching across the Americas and the Philippines. It was one of the most powerful dynasties the world had ever seen. But there was a problem. Once you accumulate that much power, you start to fear losing it. The Habsburgs became obsessed with control. What if an outsider married into the family and claimed part of the empire? What if the wealth got divided, diluted, handed over to rival dynasties? So they made a decision that would define their bloodline for centuries. They would keep it in the family. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The Spanish branch married the Austrian branch. And then the Austrian branch married back into the Spanish line. Over and over again. Generation after generation. Until their family tree stopped looking like a tree at all. It became a circle. And this is where biology enters the story. When two unrelated people have a child, their genes mix. If one parent carries a harmful recessive gene, there's a good chance the other parent carries a healthy version that cancels it out. The child grows up fine, but when two close relatives have a child, they share large portions of the same DNA. And those harmful genes, they don't cancel out anymore. They stack, they double, they activate. The result is devastating. Birth defects, weak immune systems, organ failure, developmental issues. Conditions that 17th century medicine had absolutely no way of understanding, let alone treating. Centuries later, researchers studied over 3,000 members of the Habsburg family across 16 generations. What they found was shocking. Among the Spanish Habsburgs, infant and child mortality reached nearly 50%. Half of their children died before adulthood. For comparison, even in that brutal time period, Most Spanish families saw about 80% of their children survive past age 10. The Habsburgs were losing half, and it only got worse with each generation. Because every time cousins married cousins, or uncles married nieces, they added another layer of genetic damage on top of everything that came before. The most visible sign of this damage was something known as the Habsburg jaw, a condition where the lower jaw grows much larger than the upper jaw, pushing forward so far that the teeth can't properly meet. It made speaking difficult, eating painful, and no matter how skilled the painter, no portrait could fully hide it. But that jaw? That was just the surface. The real damage was happening underneath, inside organs, inside immune systems, inside the brain, and Margaret Theresa was born right into the middle of it. She came into the world on July 12, 1651, inside the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. Her father was King Philip IV of Spain. Her mother was Mariana of Austria. And if that sounds normal at first, it shouldn't. Because Mariana was Philip's niece, he married his own sister's daughter. There was nearly a 30-year age gap between them. Philip was in his 40s. Mariana was just 14 when they married. This wasn't a love story. It was politics. Philip's first wife had died. His only surviving son from that marriage, Balthazar Carlos, had died at just 16 from smallpox. Spain desperately needed a male heir. So Philip married his teenage niece and hoped for a son. Instead, their first child was Margaret, and from the moment she was born, she became the most politically important girl in Europe. Because if Philip died without a male heir, the entire Spanish Empire could pass through her to whoever she married. Every royal house in Europe wanted control of that marriage. Here's how extreme her ancestry was. A normal person, 5 generations back, has 32 different ancestors. Margaret Theresa had just 10. Her family tree didn't spread outward, it collapsed inward, repeating the same names over and over again, until her lineage looked less like a tree and more like a closed loop. And the consequences were immediate. Over the next few years, Philip and Mariana had 4 more children after Margaret, 3 sons and a daughter. Every single one of them died in infancy, except one, a frail, sickly boy born in 1661 named Charles. This boy would grow up to become Charles II of Spain, later nicknamed the Bewitched, and he would become the most extreme example of Habsburg inbreeding in history. But in 1651, when Margaret was born, Charles didn't exist yet. And Margaret was still the prize everyone wanted, especially the Austrian Habsburgs. Emperor Leopold I, the head of the Austrian branch, had his eyes on Margaret from the moment she was born. And in the Habsburg world, the logic made perfect sense. She was his niece. She was also his cousin, which to them made her the ideal bride. Leopold began requesting portraits of Margaret when she was still a toddler. The great court painter Diego Velázquez was commissioned to paint her again and again, at age 2, 3, 5, 8. Each painting was sent across Europe to Vienna, so Leopold could watch his future wife grow up, like a man tracking an investment. One of those portraits became the most famous of them all, Las Meninas. What most people see as a masterpiece was, in part, something much colder, a visual update sent from Madrid to Vienna. Your bride is growing up well. Margaret's father, Philip IV, delayed the marriage for as long as he could. He understood the danger. If Margaret married Leopold, and then young Charles died, Leopold could try to claim the Spanish Empire through her. Philip wanted Margaret to remain a queen in her own right if that moment ever came. not a puppet in the hands of a powerful husband. But the pressure was relentless. In April 1663, the betrothal was officially announced. Margaret was 12 years old. Leopold was 23. The marriage contract was signed that December. Then, on April the 25th, 1666, the wedding by proxy took place in Madrid. Margaret was 15. Leopold wasn't even there. Another man stood in for him at the altar, while a teenage girl was married off to her uncle-cousin in a ceremony designed to secure dynastic power. 3 days later, Margaret left Madrid forever. She traveled first by sea, then by land, through Milan, through Venice, through city after city where crowds gathered to celebrate her arrival. A royal procession, a grand spectacle. But beneath all the music and ceremony, the truth was simple. A 15-year-old girl was being delivered across Europe like a package. She finally arrived in Vienna in December 1666, where the real marriage ceremony took place. Margaret Theresa of Spain, age 15, stood beside Leopold I, age 26. He was both her uncle and her cousin, and her purpose in Vienna was brutally clear: produce heirs, as many as possible, as quickly as possible. What happened next destroyed her in just 6 years. And what makes it even more tragic is that, by most accounts, the marriage itself was not cruel in the usual sense. Margaret and Leopold actually seem to have been fond of one another. They both loved music. They shared an interest in art. She called him uncle because that was literally what he was. He called her Gretel